Good afternoon, members, and welcome to the Scrutiny Management Panel. I'm Leo Madden. I'm the Vice Chair of this panel, but I'm chairing the meeting today because Councillor Tom Wood is not available. As you know, if there's a fire alarm here, we've got to vacate the building via the stairs, not the lift, and gather at the Queen Victoria Monument. We are live streaming today, so I do hope that members will put the microphone on. Interestingly, an earlier meeting today of Governors in Audit, Michael Lowther got a message through to say that Ian Bland wasn't putting his microphone on. Isn't that interesting? So as a member of the public phone through.
If I may interrupt you, Chair, it's amazing that anyone was interested in what I had to say.
Maybe they weren't, but it's just, yeah. So do, if you have anything to say or anything, do put your microphone on, okay? So, Jane, apologies.
You've received apologies from Councillor Tom Wood, and Councillor David Fuller is here to deputise for him, and you've also had apologies from Councillor Hugh Mason.
So that apologies from Councillor Simon Bosher, who clearly got up to Cambridge instead of here.
Okay, and we're here for one item only this afternoon, which is a presentation on the council budget for 1920 and the medium-term forecast from 2021
Did you say phantom budget?
22, 23. So I'm going to hand over to Chief Finance Officer, Mr. Chris Ward.
Thank you, Chair. As you know, obviously there's an important council meeting coming up, and this is your opportunity to receive a presentation beforehand, make any representations that you want, that you would feel that you need to the Cabinet before they consider it next Tuesday, and then for it to be forwarded on to full council beyond that on the 12th of February. So I thought I'd take you through the budget report in brief in a kind of chronological way. So there's 6 parts to this. I'll start, but on the advice of members, skip over the financial context fairly quickly. I think you're well aware of what that is. It will be a repeat of what I've said to you many times before. Then talk about the revised budget, so this year's budget and any revisions to the current year's budget. Then look ahead to next year's budget and how that's been constructed and what the key features of next year's budget look like, or proposed budget look like. And then if we start to look at what we think the future holds in terms of the Council's financial position for the following 3 years, so the 3 years beyond next financial year. Then there's a section on the capital programme and the capital investment proposals of the administration, and then obviously I'll sum up an opportunity for questions. But if you'd like, I'll stop after every significant part and see if there are any questions at each stage. So just a little bit of history. This is obviously is a rising number every year, but from between when austerity started, which really started for local authorities in around about 2012-13, since that point the council has had to deal with, in particular, a number of funding reductions from government. And on top of that, you have the usual increase in costs that you would expect every year, arising from inflation, but also sometimes we have unavoidable budget pressures, and they tend to manifest themselves in the care services, whether it be adult social care or children's social care. If we looked at and tried to quantify what the scale of that over that period was, it amounts to around about 116 million. So there's 116 million pounds worth of financial pressures on the council arising either from uplifts in costs or reduction in funding.
It's per year?
No, this is cumulative. Yeah, so this is cumulative. So the cumulative funding reductions from government over that period have been 78 million pounds. Obviously, the council needs to set a balanced budget, and so if we look again at that cumulatively, how has the council balanced its budgets over the whole period? It's raised council tax by 18 million pounds, so the balance has come from savings and efficiencies. So that's 98 million pounds, and if we then seek to extend that into what we know for next financial year, which is a further £4 million worth of savings, over the whole period, including 2019-20, i.e. next financial year, the council will have made savings and efficiencies of just over £100 million. And contextually, it's 48% of the council's controllable spending. So it's a really significant sum.
It's annual controllable spending, or over that whole period?
So what we do, if we use our baseline as 2011-12 and say what was the budget at that point and what is the net budget now, how much has it changed by? And it represents about 48%.
If it were 100 million in 2011-12, it would be 48 million now.
Yeah, that's right. You'd expect the council to have a plan. It has got a plan, and it's got a well-rehearsed medium-term financial strategy now. As you will be aware, there are 4 strands to the council's overall strategy. Each of those strands has impacts over different time periods. So some strands have a short-term impact, and other strands have a much longer-term impact. I won't go into all of the detail of it, but it's effectively a strategy that's been adopted by all administrations, which effectively is effectively avoidance to cuts. So exploit every other opportunity to make a saving, whether that saving be additional income, whether it be an efficiency saving, or whether it be a reduction in service. Exploit your efficiency savings and your income opportunities before you come to consider what service reductions might be. But that's been a common theme throughout all administrations over that whole period. So if we just wind the clock back to the budget last financial year and the council meeting, at that council meeting, the forecast for the following 3 years was that the council had a £12 million deficit or budget deficit. Now what that meant was that by the time we get to 2021-22, the council's net spending needed to be £12 million less than it is in the current year. So how do you achieve that, and how do you phase those reductions over that period in a way that is reasonable and is manageable for the council? So the council generally resolves to evenly phase any savings that it has. So that would mean 4 million for the coming financial year, a further 4 million for the year after that, and then a further 4 million for the year after that.
This is now annual and not annualised. I mean, this annual as opposed to cumulative.
4 each year.
So this year
well,
will fall down,
cumulative.
next year will be 8 million down, and next will be 12 million on this year.
Correct. So if you were to try to work that out cumulatively, you effectively multiply it by 6. Yeah. But it's a 4 million, then a further 4 million, then a further 4 million. But obviously, we have some budget issues at the moment because we have underlying deficits in both adult social care and children's social care. Combined, they amount to £7.6 million. Now, as we go through the presentation and the budget report, you will see what the proposed remedies to those underlying budget deficits are, as well as providing for a balanced budget in next financial year.
So in reality then, if we were just looking at, without seeing further slides, the deficit for next year would be 4 plus the 7.
Correct.
So we're really 11 million under it, okay.
Yeah.
7.5.
Or whatever, yeah.
Yeah. So it does mean that we need both obviously a strategy to deliver the 4 million and a separate strategy to deliver the 7.6. So that's all of the, if you like, the background and the context. If we start to move into the proposals now to revise the current year's budget, so what you will have seen over the course of the year is that the council has had a forecast overspend in those services, or largely relating to those services of children's and adult social care. And at Q2, we were forecasting an overall £4.5 million forecast overspend.
Over the contingency or within it?
That was over the council's contingency. So if we looked at everything that the council had, we were forecasting an overall £4.5 million overspend at that
And what was the
stage.
contingency?
In total, it was...
I think 8.1, wasn't it? Something like that?
I think it's slightly less than that. I think it's 7... £6.4.
What you're saying is that we've overspent by 10.4 million over the portfolio when all the rest of it.
Yeah.
So it's a 10.4 million overspend for
If
17
you
years.
excluded the contingency, yes.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I mean, the contingency is designed to be spent in extremis, not,
Yeah, that's right. But it's
Chris,
fair
can I
to
just stop you there? I've just realised that I didn't go round the room because of the live streams. So can I do that then? So I'm Leo Madden and I'm chairing the meeting.
I'm Ian Lyon, Councillor for Nelson Ward.
Councillor Scott Pater Harris, Hillsey Ward.
Councillor David Fuller from Fratton Ward.
Jenny Brent, councillor.
Jane Didino, Local Democracy Officer.
Chris Ward, Director of Finance.
Thank you all for that. Apologies.
Sorry, Chair. Is there any declarations of any interest? Did you want to say?
You don't need that because this is information. We're not making decisions. We're just listening.
You're going to fill out the deficit then, are you? You're going to pay out who often?
Just a quick question, Chris, if I may. We're talking about contingency. So how much have we dipped into contingency this year?
It will become clear when I get through this slide, but within the council's contingency, we had always planned that there would be budget pressures in adults and children's social care. So in a sense, we had planned for some adults and children's social care within the council's contingency. So when we talk about a contingency of 6.4 million, there was over £3 million within that contingency that was deliberately allocated to the contingency to guard against the risks in adults and children's social care. That's obviously come to fruition and more. So
So is it you saying it's spiralled more than what was expected?
it is the overspend is more than was anticipated, yes. Even with the amounts that we'd set aside within the council's contingency.
Thank you, that's perfect.
So the revised budget itself, though, and the proposal to council is actually for a balanced budget in the current year, which will only require a draw on reserves of, I think the figure is around about £50,000. Okay, so obviously the question is, with all of these potential underspendings and overspendings, how has the proposed budget been brought into balance? So within the budget report itself, it suggests that the way to cover the council's overspendings in children's social care and adult social care will be to increase the council's contingency from the 6.4 million by £3.5 million. That doesn't increase the budgets of those two services, but it does provide the total amount provide coverage for the total amount of the forecast overspends in those two service areas.
Does that mean, therefore, that you're going to take £4 million out of spending and add 3.5 million to the contingency? So we're actually finding an extra 7.5 million quid, is what you're saying? Or are we taking the contingency out of reserves?
No, we're not doing that.
So to balance that
Let me get
budget-
to the end of the slide, and hopefully the numbers will speak for themselves. So the forecast overspends, 3.5 million on contingency, sufficient to be able to cover the overall overspends in adults and children's social care. We've been reporting over the period as well that MMD is likely to not to meet expectations, and that's a £3 million overspend. And there are the costs of the disposal costs associated with Victory Energy of £2.5 million. We've also been reporting through the year that there are underspendings in Treasury Management. We've updated that figure to where we are today, and that will be 3.3 million. We have received additional funding over the year of 1.8 million. One element of that is basically a surplus that the government held on a particular account, which was to fund local authorities with business rate losses. It didn't need to do that, so it's distributed that surplus across local authorities. Yeah, it's given the money back. The important thing is, and it's set out in the report, is the principle of that, which is it was taken from local authorities in the first place in order to provide funding for local authorities who have significant business rate losses. The important principle is it's stayed within the local government system and it hasn't been withdrawn from it. But the real, if you like, the real consequence of the forecast overspend in order to balance the budget is to reduce the revenue contribution that was planned in the current year to the capital programme. That obviously has a knock-on effect on the capital investment, the amount of potential new capital investment for the following financial year. So that's a reduction of 3.5 million. All of those things together balance out the council's overall budget for 18-19.
So we got, look at the social care budget and look at the additional funding, Chris. I think we got something like 890,000 for the winter pressures within adult social care and CCT and all the rest of it. Is that included in those figures?
It is, yeah.
Which figures? Both of them?
It's in the adult social care figures. So, so what's happened is we've received money in both the current year and next financial year for winter pressures. So we received.
Is that, so that's the 890 in total, or is it 890,000 plus 890,000?
Yes, both. So we've received 890,000 in this financial year to fund the winter pressures programme, and the government have announced that that will continue into next financial year, but they've only announced it for next financial year only and not beyond that. So we've got 890 in each of those years.
Chris, am I right in thinking that adult social care with the precept actually is going to have a cash increase this year?
Overall, they will. Overall, it's on a future slide, but overall, adult social care will receive it will receive additional funding of 1.1 million from the precept and a further £500,000 on top of that from this additional funding that government announced for next financial year that was to fund adult social care and children's social care, and within that pot, which I'll explain better later, is the winter pressures money as well. So that deals with the revenue budget and the overall consequence of being able to balance that budget, which is basically through reduced ability to spend on capital investment for next financial year.
And you're saying that you anticipate that the worst outcome will be that it eats 50 grand into the reserve?
Yeah.
And can I just ask you what you predicted last year?
I can't remember what I predicted last year.
Well, I don't remember you predicting that we'd actually be dipping into reserves last year, which we have had to do with the £4 million that we've overspent this year. Well, I mean, we will have. You're not paying off last year's overspend in this year, are you?
No, but in 2018-19, there's been a very small withdrawal from general reserves of just 50,000 in this proposed revenue budget. Revised budget.
Okay. So in other words, what you are saying is that
the culmination of all of those things result in a
mean that we won't have a £4 million
correct
call on the reserves.
Exactly, that's right.
Okay. But we can't do this every year, obviously.
No. So there is a plan, and there's a plan for both adults and children's social care. Okay. So if we start looking forward now into next financial year, the first thing to say is that the council have already made certain decisions in relation to next financial year. So it made those decisions at the December budget meeting. If you recall, I'm sure you do recall, that was the meeting where the council approved the £4 million worth of budget savings for next financial year. At the same, so the council's, if you like, instruction to me was go ahead and prepare the budget on the basis of those savings that we've approved. Within that report as well, it also suggested that the council prepare its budget on the basis of 2.99% tax increase for general purposes. And it also suggested that, and that's broadly an inflation-based level, because September inflation figures were 2.3% on CPI, 3.2% on RPI. Our pay inflation for the coming year was just over 3%, and our contracts tend to be tied to RPI as opposed to CPI. So it's generally an inflation-based level. It's also the level that the government have set the referendum limit at, or the capping limit, which we'll come to on a subsequent slide. In addition to that, the report also suggested that we should take advantage of the flexibility that's been offered to increase the social care precept, so the council tax for a further 1.5% in order to be able to passport that funding directly to adult social care. That levers in about 1.1 million. But as I've said earlier on, they have an underlying budget deficit of 2.5 million. 1.1 clearly isn't enough to cover that 2.5. And in addition to that, there will be the demographic pressures associated with the living longer population. But again, this is all wrapped up in the proposals that will come forward for 2019-20. So the local government settlement, obviously it's a key part of the budget for next year because it forms part of the council's funding. You'll probably remember that the council entered into what was called a 4-year settlement. This is next year is the last year of that 4-year settlement.
2021.
No, 1920, yeah. Sorry, 1920 is the last year of the 4-year settlement, because you'll probably be aware we've got a comprehensive spending review coming up next year, and that's the reason why the 4-year settlement ended next financial year. So the settlement that we have got for next year is in line with the 4-year settlement and is in line with the council's forecast. So it's a £5.3 million reduction in funding from government for next financial year. So this is the conversation we started earlier, but we have had an announcement that the council will receive at this stage, I don't want to call it one-off, it's just only been announced for next financial year. But for next financial year, there's an additional £2.4 million, and that's to be spent on both adults and children's social care, but with the restriction is the wrong word, but with the caveat that part of that 2.4 million must be for winter pressures. So the continuation, Leo, of the £900,000 for winter pressures.
Can I just, is that ring-fenced?
The 900 is, the rest of it isn't. So the winter pressures money is ring-fenced, but the rest of it isn't. As we go through the presentation, you'll see what the proposals are for the balance of the £1.5 million that's left remaining out of that 2.4. Also, as part of the settlement, the business rate pilots were announced. So if you remember, in the current year, we are what's called a business rate pilot, 100% business rate pilot in the current year, which effectively means that in the old system, it was a 50% scheme, so any growth, you get to keep 50% of yourself, and the other 50% was retained by government. In a 100% scheme, you get to retain all the growth, so in effect, you get to retain the government share of growth. Government have changed that for next financial year to a 75% scheme, so every local authority that wanted to be a pilot had to reapply. It was a level playing field again, so it was always based on the strength of your application. The Solent authorities, Portsmouth, Isle of Wight and Southampton, made another application to be in the 75% scheme, which still provides benefits for all councils, but not at the same level as the scheme that we're in this year. It basically halves the benefit. because instead of taking the full amount of government's growth, you only now take the half of government's growth. And whilst not always that exciting, there are 2 consultation papers that are currently out that were announced as part of the local government finance settlement, and they're absolutely crucial for next financial year and ongoing. It's probably the biggest upheaval in local government finance certainly since I can remember. I'll come on to it a little bit later. So oh yeah, I wish my memory was that good. I've said already that the referendum threshold, or the capping threshold that was announced for council tax, is 3%, so we can't go beyond 3% increase without going out to a referendum. And the social care precept flexibility remains intact, so you may recall that local authorities were allowed to increase their council tax by 6%, but over a 3-year period. You were allowed to accelerate that if you wanted to over a 2-year period. We're now coming to the final year of that, and Portsmouth have got 1.5% of the 6% left to be able to take if it chooses to do so. That is built into our overall forecast for next financial year, or budget for next financial year, and it's the 1.1 million that I mentioned on the previous slide that you then directly passport to adult social care.
Can I just say, we took 3% the first year, and we've taken 2 sets of one. We will have taken 2 sets of 1.5.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Could I ask, sorry, I haven't looked through it. So this is the final year of the 1.5%, or the 6% over 3 years. Is that mentioned in one of the 2 consultation papers above as to the future precepts or whatever for anything? It's not?
No.
Okay.
If I talk a little, actually, this is the right point for me to talk about those consultations. We've got 3 big things going on next year that will have an effect on future funding for local government. We've got the comprehensive spending review. You all know that sets the overall envelope for public sector spending and how much of that will be allocated to local government. So we don't know the outcome of that, obviously. So that sets the overall quantum then to be divided up between every single council. We've got this thing called the Fair Funding Review, which effectively it will be a completely different funding formula for local government. The other part of the review is that the current funding formula that was in place was, the last time it was reviewed is 2013-14. And so generally nothing has changed since then. It hasn't even been updated for changes in data across local authorities, i.e. if your population's changed or anything like that. It hasn't been updated since 13-14. So now we get complete change in the formula and how the money is allocated, and complete update of all the data at the same time. The emerging things that are coming out of the consultation are that the 3 biggest funding drivers probably for this council will, number 1, be related to adult social care, number 2, children's social care, and number 3, population, in that order. At the same time, we also have the consultation on what the business rate retention scheme will look like for the future. Now, that basically sets the rules for how much business rate growth will you be able to retain, or how much business rate loss, if your business rates go down, will you suffer. And it will also say and how long will you be able to retain that growth for. That's known as a reset. So you get to keep your growth for a period of time, and then you hit this thing called a reset. Then all of your growth is taken away from you and redistributed across every other local authority on the basis of need. So you may get some of it back depending on where you are in the pecking order according to relative need. It's really quite complex, but I guess the only thing that I can say is that it creates a massive uncertainty for the council's future financial forecasts.
Sorry, what we have then, on the fairer funding review, there'll be the pot of money to go to local government.
Yeah.
There'll be a different system of doing it.
Correct.
We could lose or benefit then.
Correct. We could be a winner or a loser. Most expectations are that the upper tier authorities will benefit. That'll be the unitaries and the counties, and the lower tier, the districts, will probably lose. But we don't know. It's kind of informed speculation at this stage. So I said as part of the local government settlement, the business rate retention pilot the council was successful again with the other two local authorities to form a Solent business rate pilot. So what does that actually mean? It's supposed to be about sharing risk and rewards across the whole. So you're in a pool. So the government's growth that we talked about earlier on, that we weren't entitled to before, that we will be entitled to now, goes into a pot. And you share that pot between the three parties. You have to design a scheme through your application process to say, this is how we intend to distribute the pot and for these reasons, and this is the criteria that's been offered. But you also have to accommodate what the government's intentions of that pot, if you like, or that distribution were. So just to kind of quantify it, the amount of business rate growth, this is quite important actually, because in this scheme you get to keep all growth from when the scheme started, which was 13-14. So it's all growth from that 13-14 baseline to now. And half of that growth, if you like, or the government's half, would ordinarily have been 15.2, but because it's a 75% scheme and not a 100% scheme, it's half of that growth that goes into the pot, which is 7.6 million, and then we divide it between the three authorities on a formula. So 60% of the 7.6 is allocated based on need. 30% goes into something called a growth and productivity pot, because part of the government's requirements for being successful in this scheme is that some of the growth got reinvested into further economic growth in your area, or trying to support economic growth. But they also wanted stability across the councils in case there was business rate loss, and therefore 10% of it is held in the fund, if you like, in the event that any of the three authorities starts to experience business rate decline. So in broad terms, what does that mean for the council? That basically means a direct allocation of 1.6 million for Portsmouth and a share of £2.2 million that goes into, we've called it growth and productivity pot. You can think of it as a capital pot, if you like, because it should be for capital expenditure, but it's in a pot that is then determined, where the allocation of that pot is determined basically by the three leaders of each of the councils. And 0.7 million is held back just in case. As I said before, this is only guaranteed for this year. We'll then move into the national scheme from next year, because part of the reason for being a pilot was that central government wanted to learn from us about how it would operate and how to help then design the new scheme. So I think if we move into that part of the budget that deals with council tax, you'll have heard from me before that the council is a low taxing authority. It's round about 10% below our statistical neighbours. So in financial terms, it's around about 6 million. So if we were at the average of our statistical neighbours, the council would have £6 million more in council tax.
Because the average size of housing here, our average council.
No, this is.
Isn't it because we have more Band A than
No, but we're comparing ourselves to our statistical neighbours, who will have a broadly equivalent council tax base to us. You know, a broadly equivalent number of proportions in A's, B's, C's, D's, E's, F's, G's and H's. But it's probably important to recognise that only about 52% of households in Portsmouth pay the full tax. The rest of households are entitled to some form of exemption or discount, whether it be single person discount or whether it be local council tax support or some other discount. So the proposals for next year are, for general purposes, we said before, 2.99% increase. That raises £2.3 million in council tax and is roughly 60 pence per week for the average council taxpayer in Portsmouth. And again, an additional 1.5% on top of that to go directly to adult social care. So that would raise 1.1 million and add 30 pence per week to the average council taxpayer in Portsmouth. So in total, a 90 pence per week increase for the average council taxpayer. Other proposals in the budget report are for what's called a changes to council tax policy, actually, is a care leavers discount scheme. So for all children that effectively leave the care of the council that were looked after children between the ages of 18 and 25, they will be under certain circumstances they will be awarded 100% exemption from council tax or 100% discount from council tax. And it's basically to recognise the council's role as a corporate parent and to help them on their journey towards financial independence.
If I remember, it's a very small beer, isn't it?
It is relatively small in financial terms to the council, partly because a number of those individuals are already receiving local council tax support. So for those that aren't, it's a relatively small amount. I think it's between £20,000 and £30,000. And the other important change to council tax policy, and this is phased in over years, is what's called the long-term empty property premium. So government gave royal assent to legislation fairly recently to say that if properties have been empty for over a certain period of time, then you can double the council tax. Once you get beyond, so that's for 0 to 2 years, and then over time it increases, and then you can triple it and you can quadruple it, but you quadruple it for those that have been empty for 10 years or more. You know, so there's a staggered approach to the premium that you can add to council tax to encourage bringing empty properties back into productive use.
Just to say that we as an authority have had some properties empty for more than 2 years. Well, what would we do with those empty properties? Because I'd like, as a council, there's 2 of them in our ward, to make sure that those are used in some form or other, but they've been held back and then there's no money available to do various things. So what incentive then is there to be we've got our own stock is lying empty, or bits of our own stock. There's none in this, it's all private.
Well, it is to the, but it is to the owner of the property. So.
If we own the property, I'm thinking of 1 to 3 Angerstein Road, for example, that's been empty for a while. I know we're selling it, but is it going to give us an incentive to sell these properties, or actually we're giving them? Actually, we're not selling; we're giving them away. We're not selling them at all. We're just giving them away. Yeah. I don't know where that comes from.
That's right. Moving swiftly on.
No, I've made my last political comment of today because I have to go and catch a train. I'm terribly sorry to leave this scintillating conversation. And Chris, you failed. You should have done this in 40 minutes.
You would have done it, you're not interrupted all the time.
It's nice to see you, Ian. If we start to put the Portsmouth element of the council tax into the context of the total council tax bill, so whilst it's not part of the Portsmouth report, it might be interesting for you to know what's happening elsewhere with the other parts of the council tax, because obviously Police and Crime Commissioner, they levy a precept, and their part of the council tax relates to Police and Crime Commissioner, and part of the council tax that residents pay relates to Hampshire Fire and Rescue Authority. Well, you may have seen in the settlement that police authorities are allowed to increase their element of the council tax by £24 a year, which is a 13.5% increase. And we've been notified that that's what they are, well, that's what they've set. And I know that that goes through a police crime panel process, doesn't it, before it's properly validated. And Hampshire Fire and Rescue equally have a referendum threshold or a capping threshold of 3%, and they intend to increase their level of the council tax by 3%. If we added all that up and looked at it and looked what it means to the Portsmouth residents' council tax, it would be a 5.45% increase in council tax.
Could I just say in relation to the police precept, I don't think people will not complain about £24 a year for more policing, but that's what they expect. Yeah. So what influence have we got as an authority, or will we be spelling out to our people that increase will actually mean more bobbies on the beat or more police enforcement or whatever, or will it all be used in new buildings for the civil servants or the public servants working for the police authority?
I can only recall what I've read in the press, which I thought said that there'd be an extra 200 police officers from memory.
Yeah, if I'm right, Chris, I think we've got two representatives on the panel.
Yes.
We've got Councillor Lynn Stagg as a co-opted member, and we've also got Councillor Dave Ashmore. So I think possibly it might be better to speak to Dave and Lynn about that, but I was under the impression what you've just said is correct, that it is for so-called bobbies on the beat rather than back office functions. Yeah. Not that I am taking overall interest in that, if I'm honest, but that's what I've read the same up.
Yeah. So I think the most significant elements of next year's proposed budget are that, obviously, as you all know, the council always provides for inflation across all services. So its starting point is let's make sure that every service is properly funded for their inflationary costs. Across the council, that's expected to be £4.7 million. There's additional funding allocated to children's social care. So if you recall, earlier on in the presentation, we were suggesting that there's an underlying deficit in children's social care of 5.1 million. So what's the remedy? Well, this is part of the remedy. Part of the remedy is award an additional funding to children's social care of 4 million, but they also have in progress what's described as a financial sustainability strategy, which they anticipate will deliver over time £2 million worth of savings, largely from not taking less, but accommodating a fewer looked after children over time. And there are all sorts of measures that they're looking at that make that a sustainable proposition, not just for the council but also for the child themselves. Adult social care. There is an important piece of context to the looked after children element, or the children's social care element, and that is that looked after children numbers have gone up by over 40% over the last 5 years. Part of it's a national trend, because there is a national increase in looked after children, and it's averaging at about 4% per annum. And whilst children's social care have not had an increase in their budget over that period, they have been exempt from savings largely over that period. Adult social care, you heard me say, has got an overall underlying budget deficit of £2.5 million. There is an additional £2.5 million allocated to adult social care, but part of that, as we said before, has got to cover the winter pressures. So around about 900,000 covers the winter pressures. Also, it's been announced that the increase in the national living wage is 4.9%, so that's quite some way above inflation. We anticipate that the cost of that to the council could be over what we'd planned, another 700,000. So the proposal within the budget report is, if you remember, that we got this extra money, but it's only announced for this year only. It amounts to 2.5 million in total. 0.9 of it has to go to adult social care for winter pressures. The remaining 1.5, 500,000 of it goes to adult social care. The other million is included within that 4 million that goes to children's social care. Other key features of the budget proposals for next year is a revenue contribution of 6.6 million to capital. So you will see that when we come to the capital programme, the amount of funding available to the capital programme will obviously be 6.6 million more than it otherwise would have been. And there is there's obviously rationale behind all of this, and it's largely based on what are the capital investment pressures that the council faces. The contingency for next year is set at 9.5 million, so we are still looking to make sure that the council's overall budget is robust. So even if there are continuing pressures around adults and children's social care, we will have, if adopted, the council will have set a budget that is robust with reasonable additional allocations for children's and adult social care and reasonable amounts set aside within the council's contingency in the event that the council still experiences pressures over and above what's above that has been allocated.
Chris, what was the contingency set aside for this year?
It was
just remind me
6.4. 6.4. Yeah.
So you've put an extra 3 million into it effectively.
Yeah.
Is that because you're anticipating problems again?
It's because we need to make sure we've got a robust budget. That in addition to that, there are significant other. The council faces risks every day. We need to have a reasonable contingency also because we don't know what the implications of Brexit are going to be. You'd expect some government support through that, but inevitably there may be some unintended costs associated with that we don't know about. There may not be. But we've taken a risk-based approach to setting the level of the contingency next year. We do a line-by-line analysis of all of the council's risks and look to see what a reasonable probability of those risks coming to fruition are. But it does cover the potential for overspends as well as a lot of other risks.
I think you alluded to it earlier. There's 3 elements of uncertainty that we're not sure about what's going to be happening in probably the next 3 years, so it probably is a quite sensible approach.
And obviously within the budget report as well is the £4 million worth of approved savings that the council have already taken a decision on. That's on the spending side. So what's happened on the funding side? Because obviously you've got to balance your spending with all of your funding. I mentioned in an earlier slide that there's been a reduction in government funding of 5.3. That's obviously taken into account. We have got additional council tax next year, in total amounting to 5.1 million. 3.4 of that is the tax increase that I mentioned, the 4.49%, which is the 2.99 for general and 1.49 for adult social care. But on top of that, we've got an increase in what's called the council tax base, so the number of council properties or households paying council tax, and that amounts to 1.7 million. We've got a business rate reduction, but that's partly to do with the fact that last year's business rates were flattered because we were in this 100% business rate pilot, and now it's dropped to a 75% pilot, but it's still more money than we'd have from business rates compared to if we weren't in the pilot scheme itself. And we have a surplus on the what's called the collection fund. So when basically our estimates of business rates and council tax have been more on the cautious side in the past, and the level of council tax and business rate receipts we've received have been more than we had estimated. So we bring that surplus in as well. I think I've already talked about the second bit. How do we make sure that we have got a robust budget and we've got budget sustainability, particularly with the problems associated, or the budget pressures associated with children's social care and adult social care? But there are plans for both. I think I've spoken about the children's plan. The adult social care plan is different in its approach, in that it has reserves upon which it can draw on to be able to have the time to address those pressures over a longer period. So there's a 3-year plan, and it relies on drawing on a couple of reserves that they have that will help them do a couple of things. One, transform the service in certain ways, and secondly, to follow through on the accommodation strategy that's largely based on concentrating the council's social care activities in its 2 best facilities, Harry Sotnick and Shearwater, as well as building a new extra care provision on the sites of Hilsey Lodge and Edinburgh House. So, and you'll see that feature in the capital programme as part of this, as part of the joined up approach. So the culmination of all of that is also a balanced budget for 2019-20. So this is the part where we get the crystal ball out and say, what does the future look like? And based on what the future looks like, determines what the council's future savings might have to be for future budget rounds. So we've done a complete comprehensive revision of our forecasts. Our central forecast now is that we think the overall position over the next 3 years is a £7.5 million deficit. So we've come from a £12 million deficit over a 3-year period. We've rolled that forecast on a year because we've dealt with the first £4 million of it in next year's budget, and we extend our forecast a year. So if you think about the 2 common years, if you like, because there's 2 common years in both of those forecasts, it was going to be 4 and 4. With 7.5, if you phase that over 3 years, it would be 2.5, 2.5, 2.5. So there has been a genuine reduction in our forecast about what we think the council's overall budget deficit will be over the future period. So just running through quickly about how did we arrive at that £7.5 million. Firstly, we're anticipating further funding reductions from government over the period of 4.3 million. On top of that, we expect inflation and pension, additional inflationary costs and pension obligations of 12.6 million. That's inflation roughly at about 3.3% per annum. Additional debt and interest costs, as we expect interest rates to start to rise over the period. So borrowing costs will start to rise. Some other net miscellaneous net pressures, about £500,000. They're things that go against you, so they are financial pressures, but areas where we will be positive on the financial side is that you heard me say earlier on that we've got planned £6.6 million worth of revenue contributions in next financial year. We're not forecasting that we'll have that in 3 years' time, so that's positive. Council tax increases at 1.99% over the next 3 years will yield probably about 3.3 million. And business rates increase with inflation every year, and we anticipate that will be about 4 million. If you add up all of those positives and negatives, it's a £7.5 million deficit over the period. But as I've said, we have got this big uncertainty about government funding going forward. comprehensive spending review, the fair funding review, and the business rate retention scheme. So my caution is that that forecast could be plus or minus 3 million.
It came up this morning at Governance and Audit about the Hampshire pension scheme.
Oh, yeah.
And it's in deficit to 319 million or something like that. Does that include putting monies into the scheme?
Yeah,
over
it
and above?
does.
It does. Okay.
What it does, Leo, is that it's basically a 1% increase per annum on the employer's contribution. So yeah, that's where, yeah, it all starts to come together, doesn't it? That's part of the 12.6 million. So, I've already kind of let the cat out of the bag, really. It's 7.5 million, and the proposal will be to phase that evenly over the next 3 years. But still, caution, those forecasts could change, particularly when we come to do a comprehensive comprehensive revision at this time next year, because this time next year we will have had the comprehensive spending review, we will know what the fair funding review looks like, and we'll know what the business rate retention scheme looks like. So that's the revenue budget. Pause for questions, carry on, capital.
To say, I mean, for anybody watching, it's still not going to be easy to save £2.5 million over each year for the next 3 years, because we've cut quite a lot.
Yeah.
Well, as you said, you know, and it's getting harder and harder.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, the important thing is if the council continues to pursue its strategy, and the new administration have got an income generation strategy that is part of the overall medium-term financial strategy, and if those initiatives can be progressed, then obviously we're in the same position, which is we've got an overall strategy that is avoidance to cuts. Capital programme, again, the capital programme is actually a fundamental part of the medium-term financial strategy, so it also should be deployed in such a way to help the overall budget deficits that the council face. So how do you do that? Well, in the first instance, you've got to meet your statutory responsibilities in any event, so that would be the first call on any capital resources. But within the overall medium-term financial strategy, and you would expect therefore in the capital strategy, how do you regenerate your economy? How do you improve prosperity? How do you reduce the demand for council services so that the council can reduce its cost? Also, how can you use capital investment to generate income, or how can you use capital investment to save you costs and make you more efficient? So they are key themes within the council's strategy. This year, there is, in comparison to other years, there's quite a lot of capital resources available to the council. It's 73 million in total. Some of it is borrowing and therefore predicated on the approval of business cases and financial appraisals. So it's not definite. It will have to pass the tests of being affordable and prudent, and so so for council it's approval in principle to borrow, but only if the borrowing can generate savings or additional income that will more than offset the debt costs associated with that borrowing. So if we break it down, there's 22.1 million of what we've described as corporate capital resources, but they are proper money, proper cash, whether it be money that the council's put in or whether it be grants that have been, capital grants that the council's received that don't have too many strings attached. Borrowing, as I've said earlier on, is 45 million, but it will require a high degree of certainty that any borrowing that the council undertakes will be accompanied by savings from that investment, whether it be income or reduced costs. Because what the council wouldn't want to do is to borrow the money, end up with some debt costs, and therefore increased its overall budget deficit and the savings that it needs to make.
Chris, I don't think we'd be able to do that. I don't think you'd let us, to be honest.
Well, I do have the protection of the kind of regulatory code that says it must be affordable, so that is true.
I just know from when we did the income generation, when we were running the administration, you were quite hot on us, making sure we could cover our obligations.
True.
That hasn't changed, I'm sure.
Hasn't changed.
Just to say, the 45 million is sort of self-imposed, isn't it? We don't have to stick to that. In fact, we don't have to use it all, but we could,
Exactly.
you know, there could, an argument could come forward for something that happens to increase the borrowing, couldn't it?
Yeah. And obviously what we're seeking at council is to get the approval in principle, because council have to approve something called the authorised borrowing limit. And if we don't get approval in principle, every time a potential scheme comes up, we will have to come back to council each and every time. So that's 45 million of that is approval to borrow in principle. There's 1.4 million proposed from the use of Cabinet members' portfolio reserves. There's
Just a quick one, Chris. Am I right in thinking that a lot of that's coming from resources?
no, the majority of it is coming from environment and community.
Okay. I know the resources have got 440,000 underspend, so that one's actually being left alone.
The resources portfolio reserve is actually almost spent.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Well, there's a general buffer of around about 250,000
Yeah, I was just thinking, it went to the meeting last week and it was 440,000 that was left
in the
from-
reserve.
in the reserve, yeah.
But you would expect them to keep a balance of around about 250,000 because if anything comes up in the year, they've got to accommodate their own contingent items.
Anything in contingency, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, thanks for that.
There's proposals in the proposed programme for schemes that rely on 2.2 million from the MTRS reserve, and we've got other earmarked reserves for specific things that are proposed to be used to support capital investment proposals as well. So I don't intend to go through all of these because there's a lot of them, but I'm going to flick them up on the screen. And this isn't every single proposal, but it's most of the proposals that will be put before council to allocate that. What I said on the previous slide was 73 million. The reason it's 77 on here is because some of it is external contributions. So the 73 million leave us in another 4 million pounds worth of external contributions to make total spend 77. But there's a lot in there. The big money is on additional school places, and we did get a fairly sizable grant from the Department for Education in order to provide for those school places. It's 8.3 in total because there's some fees. Yeah. But there's
Some of the money for school places we're putting in as a council, about 500,000 or thereabouts. Chris,
Yeah.
Could I just ask about Station Square? I presume that's in front of Portsmouth and Southsea Station.
correct.
For some reason I always thought that Network Rail or British Rail or whoever owned that. So do we own the open space in front?
I think that's a good question. I can't say definitively, but I think the intention of the investment is around the area from where the drift bar was, moving up, and on the other side of the road. Yeah. There's some obviously the proposals in there that relate to the port and MMD are sizable, but again, they are ones that are subject to business case, subject to financial appraisal, subject to providing adequate surety that any investment will repay itself.
Chris, on MMD, how much have we invested so far?
Well, when you say how much have we invested, we've advanced loans of, I think, around about £8 million in total, but they're all being repaid, and they have been repaid on time and with interest. So there is, we've provided financing, and it's been repaid over the relevant period.
Okay, I'm just asking because I know that obviously MMD's been a lot in the press lately, so I don't want to dwell too much on that. But also with the Geese Line contract going elsewhere, is there any chance, has that been forecasted in, obviously moving forward, because that was a significant loss for us?
Yeah, it has. Yeah, because it was a significant loss. They were the biggest customer of MMD, but obviously what we're seeking to do is to replace that business. Well, there's a number of things. There'll be a report actually to the Cabinet shortly, which is a complete strategic review of the MMD site. So what are all the alternative uses, including the continuation of MMD, but what are all the other alternative uses? And it is mentioned in the budget report.
Yeah, I did see that. There's 6 different options that they've picked out, and I think one of them says retain. I think the rest say liquidate, which is quite a concern. So I just hope that the Cabinet look at that and actually don't liquidate MMD as basically an employer within the city. It's quite a concern. But also, it was subject to a state aid investigation. Is that still ongoing?
The council has successfully defended the state aid complaint against us. So that's now gone away.
That is good news.
But there is mention in the budget report on MMD, and there is mention of that report, that strategic review of all options, and it does mention what the emerging conclusions are, particularly on the financial side, which basically sets out that the continuation of MMD in financial terms over the next 20 years, taking into account all of the necessary capital investment that's required, assuming that it's provided and all of the debt costs are paid, that it is by a significant margin, the best financial option for the council for that site. That's been done independently as well. It's been done by, all of the options have been reviewed by an independent expert, and we also had independent financial evaluation as well, just to give the council comfort.
Just out of interest, who's been privy to those business cases from members?
Which business cases?
For this MMD, which members have seen it? I imagine my group leader probably would have.
Your group leader will be very aware of this because she's a board member of MMD. Aside from that, obviously, it will be the cabinet member for Pred here, Ben. But they're still not finalised. So what they will have seen is an early iteration. And really, the final thing for me on capital is to say that the council's capital obligations and aspirations far exceed what the council would normally receive on an annual basis in terms of capital funding. So we've set out in that table there some of the potential either future costs associated with our statutory responsibilities, or some of those things that are future aspirations. And if we encapsulate all of those, and it's a wide range of costs, mainly because the cost of the sea defence scheme is still unknown or subject to significant variation, but there's a wide range of cost for the future for those schemes if the council is to pursue them, ranging between nearly 16 million up to 56 million. But if we set borrowing aside just for a second, the council's capital resources on an annual basis probably about £7 million a year. So when I said earlier on that we've got £22 million worth of corporate resources, you can see that this financial year the council is in a sense flattered by the amount of capital resources that it has. But that's because of the significant amount of revenue contributions that have been going into the capital programme. So it only highlights the need for the council to be able to bid for funding to support some of these capital schemes. And quite often when you bid, the routine these days is if you want if you want to bid for external funding, you usually have to put some match funding in of your own. So it's quite important to make sure that you've got the capacity to be able to match fund in order to lever in some of the bigger sums of money that you'd want for your larger aspirational schemes. And equally, you could also seek to make revenue contributions to the capital programme, which is why one of the recommendations in the budget report will say, and it's to an extent it's a fingers crossed strategy, but it's still a potential eventuality. If there are any underspends at year end, let's transfer it into capital resources, because we have got a big, what you might describe as a capital gap. So if I rattle through the summary of that, balanced budget for 2018-19, balanced budget for 2019-20, but in balancing that, still allocating additional money for children's social care of 4 million, additional money for adult social care of 2.5 million. It's based on a tax increase of 4.49%, that we participate in the business rate pilot and we gain by an extra 1.6 million as a consequence. And overall, the council position still remains sound. Forecast for future years, it's now a £7.5 million deficit, phased broadly 2.5 million, 2.5 million, 2.5 million in each of the following 3 years. They are further 2.5 millions. And the capital programme, statutory obligations met, that largely centres around the requirement to provide for additional school places. But looking ahead to the future, we've probably got capital gap, and therefore it's important that we seek to bid, get match funding, and also make revenue contributions in the future. I know it's intricate and complicated, but...
Well, thank you, Chris, but I think we probably covered it all in the questions during the presentation, I think. Anybody?
Yeah, I'm happy there. I've got stuff I want to keep for next week.
Yeah. Well, the week after even.
Yeah, I've got questions I'll ask in 2 weeks' time.
Chris, thanks very much. And thank everybody else for coming. Thank you.